we're going to be looking at the key success factors for using A-Spec in a full digital ASCON data workflow. So with the whole ASCON workflow, there's a lot of moving parts. And how do we bring all of these parts together, and how do you get a comprehensive solution that will cover all the bases to make sure that this entire workflow is implemented successfully and you actually get the full benefit from doing it? And the benefits that you're looking at is the time-saving benefit, the cost benefit, the better data quality benefit, the improved communication benefit. So there's a number of benefits, but you've got to have all the necessary components in order to get the best out of the entire improved process. So I'm going to start off with this. We are talking about the A-Spec standard, but what I'm going to do is look a little bit first off in choosing the as constructed standard. There's a variety of different things there. So the great thing about standard is there's so many to choose from, which is one of those old sayings. So in Australia, there's three broad direction in terms of standards. So if you're in Western Australia, Victoria, A-Spec is the definitive standard. If you're in Southeast Queensland and to an extent in South Australia, ADAC is the standard that is mostly used. Then there's a number of organizations that's using a custom standard or their own standard. So ACT using ACT Ref 11. Up in far north Queensland, there's the FNQ ROC standard. Organizations such as Barwon Water and Auckland Council using their own standard or their own configuration as well. So there are different pros and cons in the different approaches, and we'll try and address some of the pros and cons within this presentation. Also in the US, there's the National CAD standard, which is a quite well regarded and accepted principle in terms of drafting within the US. So we've taken the US National CAD standard and added a universal data model to that, so that you can define not only the CAD information but all the attributes that you would need within that environment. So that's part of what we've done, is not built a hard-coded to one standard solution, but a totally configurable solution that you can plug and play it in any area and in any environment. So in choosing a standard, the fundamental question starts with what is the information I need to meet my asset management requirements. So it's basically, from an asset management perspective, what's the questions I need to answer? And in order to answer those questions, what is the information I need to have to be able to answer the questions that I would need to answer? Now, asset management is not a static environment. I was at a council meeting where the council is introducing a new levy in terms of asset management, where they're looking for extra money, and one of the people asking, but if it's better to do the maintenance now and not wait for it into the future, why haven't you been doing this for the last 10 years? Asset management is not a static science. Asset management is an improving science, and if we introduce all sorts of factors such as machine learning and artificial intelligence, and we're learning a lot more, we are getting better at managing the assets. But in order to do that, we need the information to be able to actually answer those questions. So it is really then about having the necessary information to actually meet asset management requirements. Now, one of the important things in there is, when is the best time to actually get that information? Obviously, the best time is when it's going into the ground. That is the time that you have got the people that did the work is actually capturing the data. They're aware of all the pros and not the pros and cons, but all the information. So that is the best time to actually get that information. The longer you leave it, the more difficult it becomes. One of the things in there is then, if you look at You've got gifted asset, external assets that's then gifted to an organization, but then you also have the capital works, and one of the big problems is then how do you get the data from the internal teams? And very often that's quite difficult to actually get that information. The auditors are typically then looking at data, so I've had a number of cases where people are actually doing the design, it then gets built, but then it never hits the asset management system. So the auditor then look at, okay, you spend this in terms of your capital works. Has that actually now been captured? It's gone into the ground, but where is it in the asset management system, and where is that catered for? So that's one of the important things that you need to look at. It is not only external, it's also the internal capital works information that need to be covered. Now, if you choose a standard, and that then goes really to, are you using the information we need currently in the GIS and asset management system, and the naming convention and the code list and everything that's within your current asset management system? Or do you take your asset management system and harmonize that with your chosen standard? So that can be quite an expensive and a long process to go through. So that's one of the things that you do need to consider looking at or employing a standard, is how is that data going to translate to your asset management system within your environment. It is a bit like with asset management systems and the asset hierarchies. If you've got 10 organizations, there will be at least 15 different asset hierarchies in there. So it is just one of those things. How do you harmonize your asset management system and the standard? So if a common standard is in an area within broad acceptance, it just makes sense to pick that same standard, because there's a lot of pre-work that's already been done. So the development community and the surveyors in the area is already tooled up and ready to produce data in that standard. So it would make sense to actually choose that common standard that is within your region, the definitive or the accepted standard. It just makes sense to then take on that same standard, broadly speaking. That then has an impact on how you're going to do that translation, how you're going to get the data in with all the issues around that. So that's one of the things that you need to consider. Now, the next thing there, taking on a standard, what you're doing is you are telling the community that this is the information that we require in order to fulfill our ASCON requirements. This is the information you need to provide to us. But that does not guarantee you better data. It guarantees that instead of just saying, well, yes, you need to give us ASCON information and we don't know what that is, you say this is the information that we require. So that is quite an important part, and defining the information that we need. So then going to both internal and external, where you then have a definition to say this is the information that we need. But that's not going to guarantee you better data. In order to get the better data, you also need to validate that information. Now, the default mechanism is you get one of the engineers to look at the data that's submitted. So basically, you are the QA system for the external or the internal team. The problem with that is you've got inconsistent validation. So if you've got two people looking at the same thing, you may get different answers or different results in there. So if you can have a process to validate that information in a standardized way, that is a very important part of that process. The other part is also traceability of the information and traceability of your data. So if you're saying that something has been submitted to our organization at this stage and it has been validated, and here's the validation process and it has passed all of these checks, if you go to the auditors with that information, that takes that process or the proving of your data integrity that one step earlier, and that makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. So let's have a look at A-Spec. So A-Spec is a comprehensive standard, so it's asking for a lot of information. Some people may say in certain areas it is actually too much, but A-Spec is quite a comprehensive standard. So there's the roads, the drainage, the sewer, the water, the building is all the published standard within A-Spec. So part of that is then in terms of your configuration and providing information for that, which ones of those have you got covered to be able to actually give the information. So A-Spec is then targeted really to councils and water utilities. There's the two, so the sewer and water spec, and then all the roads, drainage, public open space. For the council environment, it is quite a comprehensive specification. So there's no telecoms and electricity. I know there has been some talk about telecoms, but nothing has been published yet. So there's that part of the underground assets is still a work in progress. So one of the things then is, if you say you've now picked a standard, then there's a few things we need to look at within a standard. So if you're going to say, yes, A-Spec, and we're going to support A-Spec 100, that is then one approach in there. But there's two options in there. If we look at in some of the regional areas that we've had at councils, what they are doing, the asset management and in the GIS, they don't need all the information, or they don't cover all the information that is asked for in A-Spec. So instead of then asking the development community to provide all of the other information, and you then only pick some information from that, that then has an impact, or it makes it easier for them. So it is basically, you can then ask for the standard minus. So that is then one approach in there. The other approach is to say, we've got one or two things that's not within the standard. So the process is you can then ask for that to be added to the standard. That is a possibility. The third component is your code lists. So in A-Spec, for example, what A-Spec would have is a code list or a lookup list, or whatever you want to call that, that covers all the utilities for the entire user base. So that would be in quite a wide area. Now, within your organization, you may have a subset of that code list. So the question then is, do you provide the full A-Spec code list to everybody, which means people can actually give you data that you not catered for within your asset management system, or that actually doesn't meet your engineering standards? So you may have your engineering standards, and within your engineering standard you say, this is the information that we have, these are the valid pipe classes, materials, diameters, etc. that we have within our region. So the question there is, then are we going to work with the actual list that is valid for all our organization, or do you work with a bigger one and then you've got to try and filter those out? And how do you handle the things that then get presented to you that is not within your standard? Next area is, when you look at asset data, what is mandatory? So if you look at an asset class, you could have, for example, I would say there's the two things. There's the must-have values, diameter, material, etc. And those ones would obviously be mandatory. The next thing then is to saying, well, if I don't know the value and we provide a -9999 value to say that value is then actually not provided, you're saying, well, I don't know. Is that acceptable? So saying something is mandatory, but then providing a cop-out that I'm not going to provide that information, is that really mandatory? So that's just that old definition of mandatory. You need to sort out, are you going to allow the I don't know answer within that, but still treat it as mandatory? Or it should really be a proper mandatory values. So then you have other information, so not always present, e.g. your relining material, etc. that could be in there, that is then not mandatory. Okay, now on this one with the lookup codes or code lists, I've got a few questions. So I'm actually going to launch a poll that will ask, how often do you upload code list values in your asset management system? So is that something that happens frequently, fairly infrequently, or is that we'll do it once a year when we add quite a lot of things in there? So annually is the answer there. Okay, so the next one I'm going to ask is, are your code lists harmonized between your GIS and asset management system? So if you've got a material in the GIS, is it the same material in the asset management system that you are working with? So it is harmonized by the GIS and asset management system, so that is good. The third thing that I would like to know is how much of an effort is it to actually introduce something new into the GIS and asset management system? So is it something that you can just go and add and it's a sort of a one-person decision-making process? Or is it a bit more difficult that you've got to go and talk to engineering teams? Or is it quite a big job that you've got to then look at what's the impact on your calculations for your asset valuations, and there's quite an involved decision-making process, and you also have to get IT involved, for example. Okay, right, so it's a medium impact, so it's not too difficult, but it's not something that you're going to do on a weekly basis or a monthly. It is more a formal process that you do want to by introducing it. So thank you very much for the feedback on those 3 polls. It is useful to know. So that has an impact then if there's a new pipe material that's being used, etc. How do you go about that entire process? So part of that process then is how we're going to introduce that. So if a developer, then there's a new material that's being used, is that in your list of approvals? So how exactly is that process going to work to make sure that new information, the right information, does get into the asset management system? So one of the things there is to actually use it in the comments field. I think that's how A-Spec recommend that you handle that. But yeah, then there's that whole process of new values to actually work with that. Okay, the next one is the concept of warnings. So there's certain things, for example, we had a good one last week where we were at one of our customers that implemented ACDC, and what we're doing is adding the ability where your upstream invert elevation must be higher than the downstream invert elevation, but then it can also check that the pipe next to its downstream invert elevation must be higher or the same than this pipe's upstream invert elevation, etc. But now sometimes you actually do have an engineering rule or engineering requirement that a pipe may actually run uphill. So there are cases where that is the case. And so we've introduced the concept of warnings. It introduces flexibility, but you then need to be aware of your approval process to say, if there's an exception and it passes the rule, but there's this warning on it, that whether you're going to accept that or not, and be aware of that process. So managing the approval of warnings is then important. So considering the engineering workflow is an important part. So you've got the likes of Civil 3D or 12D to CAD for construction drawings. It's designed, then you do the for construction information that then gets built, and then the as constructed data has to be done. So typically in the environment, on a training session with a new council that we introduced, so they've got 20 different surveyors and contractors, and they had AutoCAD, BricsCAD, ListCAD, and one was using a GIS package. So that was the typical environment that people are using to actually prepare the as constructed drawing. So that's an important part of the process in looking at the entire workflow, but in the entire life cycle, that you have to take the design information into account and the ability for people in the environment to actually provide that information. So how do we get that done with the as constructed information and the as constructed drawings? Part of that is then catering for the drawing tools that people use in the field, and that is where it is important to say, okay, we're looking for data in a specific format. So ADAC is asking for it in XML. Officially, A-Spec is using MIF and shapefiles, but it is important to be able to deliver the information in the right format, but also enable the people to give it to you. So what we're doing then there is actually matching CAD templates and blocks, and change slightly the way that they would actually present the data. So instead of dump text all over the show, it is then using the attributed blocks. to present the data. So if you look within the A-Spec, there's all the standard information. So then the next thing is to say, if you're looking at A-Spec, how are we going to get that data into the GIS and asset management system? So one of the things that we typically do is we make a staging environment that is a one-to-one with A-Spec, and then you can go and take that information and load that into the GIS and asset management system. So we can load that directly, or you can do it via the staging environment. Now, depending on your environment and how that is set up and with the integration, there's sort of the two ways where you can put everything into the GIS and then it's integrated with the asset management system, and that will then flow into the asset management system. Or it can be that you want some data on the GIS and some in the asset management system. So then there's the two broad approaches that you can take. You can load information that you need into the GIS, and it can be directly, or it can be via the staging environment, and you can then split off into the asset management load process. So those could be load files, etc. So we've actually got that. We're expanding that whole process to generate the load files, so you can actually go and do calculations and specify information that is outside of the information that you are providing. So in terms of the asset classes and asset identifiers, and what is the design date and the build date, which may be slightly different from the information that's provided in the as constructed process. So yes, what we do is we provide a complete and proven solution. It's got all the standards, it's configurable, and if you do not subscribe to A-Spec, you can use your own standard as well, hence the configurability. We've got the tools to enable the consultants to go and capture the data, so that's the attributor, and we've got the attributor then for AutoCAD as well as for BricsCAD to be able to do that. So the tools that the standard is embedded within the configuration documents that we provide. So you don't have to provide them with here's a 200-page document. So some of the document is in terms of drafting type, but in terms of here's a list of all the valid code lists and which layers should it be on. All of that is embedded in the template. So it's basically you provide it as part of the CAD standard. Most organizations have got their own CAD standard that they can then provide. If you're going to draw something, these are the layers that we want to use, so you provide that, plus then all the attributes that you need, plus all the code list in there. So the standard is embedded in the configuration documents, which enables the people to actually give you that information and submit that to you. Notification, documentation, what's all the validation that we're working with, all of those kind of things is quite important. So the as constructed DC in the portal has been under development for more than 10 years. We've had more than 10,000 drawings validated through the portal, so that is quite a lot. These submissions to the portal is actually doubling year on year for the last 3 years, so that is improving, or that's a lot more that is going through the portal. And it is a total configurable solution in terms of CAD domain values, data rules, outputs. So one of the areas that we are focusing on is how do you produce this configuration? So if you want to change something, how do we go about that configuration? And so we're automating that entire process, that if you do that in the configuration, all the menus, the configuration files for the attribute, both for AutoCAD and for BricsCAD, will just fall out of the configuration, as well as then the drawing templates. So yeah, our idea is that once it's configured, to do any modifications is then quite a simple process to provide those updates. So yes, it's rolled out in the US with a national CAD standard with a universal data model that we are working with. So this is then the portal at asconstructed.com that we have. So some information about that, the registration for people where we can then just go go and do my portal login. And once I'm logged in, so I'm in as an asset owner that you have, and so this then gives us our dashboard, administration component, the validations, documents. Importantly, then also a training component where we can help both internally and externally on how to work with it, and also importantly a help section. So we spend quite a bit of time and effort to provide the help system and to expand that. So in here is the customer guide to accepting and rejecting submissions. There's the developer's guide to submissions, gives you the introduction, registration, how do I get my configuration documents, how do I make a submission to the portal. In there, if you've got GIS files, so shape files, etc., what happens if it fails validation, how do I resubmit, what happens if I pass the validation, and then the same with the drawing files, the resubmission and the process around that. Then summaries and later submissions, all of the information around the dashboard, and then summary of the submission, and then also common validation errors. So we're expanding this quite a lot with the latest release that's available shortly. All right, so the whole idea, just in terms of the quick process, is going in and you would start off and say your organization. You can manage your own organization and offices, and then we're going to manage the developers. There's a lot of developers already registered on the portal, so you can see there's quite a list. So a lot of the majors are already on here, A-Spec, SciTech, etc. So working with all the different organizations. So there's a lot of different developers already registered on the portal. And so all you do is, from the big list you assign, these are the people that we are working with. And once you've then assigned people to the list, that will give them access to your information. So the important thing there is then on the documents, making information available. So you then, in this documents component, is to say this is the information that we're going to give you access to, and once you've assigned them, they will be notified that they now have access to you as an organization. And if you upload new documents, they will be notified that there's new documents for them to work with. Once I've created that, we go to managing the projects, and we're going to create a new project, and we'll give it a project number, when is it due, who's the person that's actually going to be the project lead, so that's typically somebody on the engineering side, and then what's your validation set. Now on this one I've got quite a lot in there that I can choose from for testing purposes. You can see there, that's the Ref 11, there's an ADAC standard, and a variety of different ones. South Australia Water, it's a hybrid of A-Spec. This is our universal data model in there. Okay, I'll go and pick that. So that is then the validation set that you're working with. So that's another important thing, that if you make changes, you can actually work with different validation sets. So if you've got a project that was started on an older version for your standard, then you still have the older one available, or you can then also change it then to say, now from which stage do you need to work on the newer one. There's the enable notification and review, and in here you can actually go and see for this project, you can actually go and have different notifications that you can go and define. And then also, do you want to enable conversion, so the portal can then convert the GIS or the CAD data into a GIS shapefile that you can work with. Okay, so yes, I've created the project. Then we're going to say, now out of my big list of developers, who can actually submit to that project? So I'm going to pick myself as well as our friends at DevCorp that can actually submit against that. And then if they go in, so if I now go and sign out here, and I'm now going to go in as a consultant or a surveyor, and I go to my projects, and say submit new. Yes, that new project that I've just created that you can then go and submit against the project. So this will then actually go and do the validation for us. If it fails validation, you would see what is the type of errors that you may have, attribute errors, spatial errors, break errors that you've got within that process. So what I'll do is just have a quick look at some of the type of errors that we may encounter. So here is some of the tests that we are doing. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. So we're doing spatial checks. So there's a relationship between two entities. So in this case, it's a property connection to a pipe. So have I got that? Is the direction of flow correct in there as well? So you can go and specify the spatial checks. We can actually go and break. So if you look at from a water perspective, where we can then go and say that a hydrant must not break a pipe, but a valve must break a pipe, and they've drawn a very long pipe across different areas. We can actually add specified node types, go and break the pipes for you. That will not really be relevant on drainage and sewer because of invert elevations. You're not going to do that, but we're doing the breaking there as well. That is part of the configuration. Yeah, some spatial errors within distances, etc. It's a variety of attribute checks that we are doing. So numerical value, too small, too large, invalid value that you may have in there, where an integer is specified and you've given real values, or the width of number is too big for the task, or you've put in characters in a numeric value. So quite a few checks. Mandatory values, date value format, so you can go and specify. There's quite a lot in there. There's also invalid string values. So if people are trying to put funny stuff in there, it can work with that as well. Polygon checks, so all sorts of different parts, especially if you're working with roads and public open space, supporting polygons with holes, they're quite important. Now what we're also doing is supporting proper arcs. Now we're not talking about an arc, it's not arc as how Esri would define it as a line string. We're talking about a proper arc with 3 points, so it's not a densified set of line strings. So all of that is then supported with the proper arcs, how that would then go through within these polygons, how that would work. Circles, closed polylines in there. So this is one of the tests that we are doing, that whenever we make any changes, we know that these are all standardized. We know what the answer should be to make sure that we do get the correct results within this process. So if we look at here's some of the compound validations, then related objects. So this is saying this poly storm pipe, there must be at least 3 different ones within that specific one. This one has got 6 in, but there can't be more than 5. Multi-range checks, attribute errors with pattern matching, material for the type, spatial errors, attribute errors. Yeah, so quite a number of different checks that we are doing to make sure that the data meet the requirements. We then give the developer all the information, so if there's any errors, it will tell you exactly what those errors are and how to actually go and fix that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into the back end of the portal and then just show you what's actually going on in the portal. So if I look at our last 20 past subdivision, so well no, actually we want to do, I'll do the last 20 all. Okay, all right, so this was submitted while we were busy with the presentation, so at 9:47 it was submitted, and it then obviously fixed, and 4 minutes later it was submitted again, and it then passed the validation and did the conversion for you to shapefiles. So what we see the first off when people start, There may be a few fails, but that gets sorted out fairly quickly. So just to then finish off there, typically what we then see the acceptance rates. So over time, it typically starts off with 3 fails to a pass. And then if we look at somebody that organizations that's been fairly used, we get somewhere around about 1.6, 1.7. So some 1 fail, 1 pass, and some 2 fails and a pass is then typically there. And it's about half an hour for them to go through the entire process. It can be quicker, as you've seen practically on here. Right, so we're more or less at the end of our time. Thank you for your attendance. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. We'll be in contact.